exposing the untold story of Richard Ramirez, what Netflix didn't reveal in The Night Stalker. The night was thick with fog, the kind that seemed to swallow everything. Every shadow, every sound. It wrapped the streets like a secret. And in that secret, something moved. Richard Ramirez. The name that made the air feel colder. He had already struck once tonight. A house on a quiet street. No warning. No sound. Just the sudden, terrifying presence of him. The house was dark, but the kitchen light flickered. A woman stood by the sink, washing dishes. Her breath steady, unaware of what was to come. The creak of the floorboard behind her. Too soft. Too precise. He didn't make a sound as he approached. His shadow stretching across the kitchen wall. A flash of metal. A sharp, unbearable feeling. The woman turned. Her eyes widened. Her body froze. But Richard Ramirez didn't hesitate. He was already on her, faster than she could react. A moment of terror, then nothing. He left without a trace. But it wasn't the first time. Or the last. The body, the blood, the fear. It became his signature. And the city? It was on edge. They didn't know where he would strike next. Would it be a house with children inside? A lone woman on a quiet street? No one knew. But one thing was certain. He was watching. Always watching. Each night, he left something behind. A piece of himself. A sign. A clue. Sometimes a symbol. But always the same. The terror. The silence. The darkness. And Netflix didn't tell you everything. They left out the details. The ones that made his presence unbearable. The ones that made you look over your shoulder at night. The ones that made you question who could be behind the mask of the man next door. Richard Ramirez didn't just kill. He haunted. And when the sun set, the city trembled. Each step he took felt deliberate. He knew the streets. He knew the darkness. He didn't need a weapon. His presence alone was enough. It was the fear he fed on. The helplessness in their eyes. The way the world seemed to slow down the moment they realized. He was there. It wasn't just about taking lives. It was about control. Power over the living. A game. A sick, twisted game. But then there were the nights when he went quiet. Too quiet. He didn't strike. He didn't hunt. And for a while, people believed they were safe. That the nightmare had ended. But deep down, they knew better. He was waiting. Watching. The night air grew thick again. The same chilling sensation filled the streets. That feeling like something was wrong. But no one could see it. No one could hear it. Until it was too late. A couple asleep in their bed. The faintest sound of metal scraping against the floor. Then the chilling cold. He was there. This time, no screams. No struggle. Just the empty, haunting silence. The fear lingered long after he left. And as quickly as it had begun, he vanished. For days, weeks, the city felt an eerie peace. But peace didn't last. The fear never truly faded. Richard Ramirez wasn't done. He was never done. He didn't leave the city. He lived in it. In the very walls. In the very ground. There were whispers. Rumors. People said they'd seen him. Felt him. But no one could prove it. Until one night. A man. An ordinary man. But his eyes. They were different. Empty. Cold. They called him a survivor. But he knew. Deep down. Richard Ramirez had never really left. And as the fog rolled in that night, the city held its breath. Because in the shadows, something was watching. The fog grew heavier. It clung to everything. The streetlights barely cut through it. Everything felt muffled, distant, unreal. The man walked down the street, his eyes darting from side to side. He didn't trust the silence. He knew it too well. He thought he had escaped. But that was before. Before he saw the eyes. The eyes that followed him. Not from the shadows. Not from behind a corner. No. These eyes were in the reflection. He caught a glimpse in a store window. A pair of eyes staring back at him. Not his. He froze. There in the reflection was Richard Ramirez. Standing just behind him. A face that should have been long gone. A face that still haunted his nightmares. But when he spun around, nothing. Only the empty street. His heart pounded. Sweat beaded on his forehead. But the eyes were still there, in the glass, staring. The man took a step back, his mind racing. Was he losing his sanity? Or was Ramirez really back?
No, it couldn't be.
He had to be imagining it. But as he turned away, there was again a glimmer, a flash of movement in the reflection. Richard Ramirez, standing at the far end of the street, his grin wide, predatory. The man's stomach twisted. His blood ran cold. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't a trick of the light. The night had come alive again. Without thinking, he turned and ran, faster than he ever thought he could, his feet pounding against the wet pavement, his breath short, desperate. But the footsteps behind him, they were faster, closer, closer. He could hear them now, just a few feet away, the heavy, deliberate steps, like a predator closing in on its prey. He spun around, but the street was empty. No one, nothing. But in the air, he felt it, the cold, the presence. Richard Ramirez was there, and he was closer than ever before. The man's skin crawled. His heart hammered in his chest. He was sure of it now. Richard Ramirez had never really left. The city belonged to him, and as the man stumbled back, he saw it, the flash of silver in Ramirez's hand. A knife. Everything stopped. The world around him froze. Then the figure lunged. Without warning, without mercy. The city's secrets were still alive. And they were coming for him, the sirens wailed. But the city felt quieter now. The paramedics worked frantically, but there was something off about the scene. The air was thick, almost oppressive. The man's body lay there, cold and still, but his mind was racing. Images flickered in his fading consciousness. Ramirez's grin, the flash of the knife, the eyes, those damn eyes. But as the paramedics loaded him into the ambulance, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching. The street, once alive with the sound of footsteps and distant chatter, felt eerily empty now. The fog didn't lift. It remained. It felt like the world had shifted, like time itself had warped around that moment. And somehow, deep down, he knew Ramirez hadn't gone far. The man's eyes fluttered open once more, just for a second. And in that brief, fragile moment,
He saw him.
there, at the far end of the street, a figure, standing perfectly still, waiting. It was him, Richard Ramirez, his silhouette barely visible in the haze. But the man knew. He felt it. His heart raced again, a desperate pulse in his veins. But as quickly as he saw him, the figure disappeared into the fog. The man wanted to scream, but his throat was raw. The ambulance doors slammed shut, and they sped away, leaving the city behind. The night dragged on, but the shadows never lifted. The fog remained thick. Even as dawn threatened to break, the streets felt unnatural, frozen in place. A few miles away, in another corner of the city, a woman glanced out her window. She couldn't explain it, but she had the feeling something was wrong. Her gaze lingered on the street, and, in that moment, just before the sun broke over the horizon, she saw him too, Richard Ramirez, standing in the distance, like he had always been there, like he never left. She blinked, and when her eyes opened again, he was gone. But the fear remained, that cold, creeping sensation, the knowing. The city was quiet, but the shadow of Richard Ramirez still lingered. And somewhere in the corners of every street, every alley, he was watching, waiting. The fog never really cleared. The fog seemed to grow thicker, clinging to the city like a permanent shroud. The sun rose, but it didn't feel warm. It felt like the light itself was struggling to break through the weight of the darkness. People went about their day, unaware of the truth that was lingering in the corners of their minds. That quiet dread, that suspicion that they were being watched. At the edge of town, a man was cleaning his car in his driveway. The sound of a hose, the rhythm of water hitting pavement. But there was something in the air, a subtle shift that made the hair on the back of his neck rise. He turned. For a split second, he swore he saw movement at the end of the street. A figure, dark and indistinct in the early morning haze. He blinked, and the figure was gone, but the feeling remained. That awful sense that someone was standing just out of sight, watching. The man shook his head, trying to shake off the unease. It was nothing, he told himself. Just his imagination. But deep down, he knew. He knew better. Down the block, a young woman stepped out of her apartment building. She paused, like she could sense it too. The silence was too complete. The street seemed empty. Yet, something lingered. Her eyes moved, slowly scanning the area, until they landed on the dark alley just behind the building. A flicker of movement. The woman's breath hitched. Her body stiffened. Was it just a shadow? Or was there someone there? She blinked again. The figure vanished. But the dread didn't fade. It stayed, like a cold weight in her chest. The fog hadn't lifted. It seemed to press closer, hugging the city tighter with each passing minute. And that was when she heard it. The sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. A slow, steady approach. She turned, her eyes scanning the street again. Nothing. The footsteps grew louder. Closer. Closer. Her heart pounded. Her breath quickened. There was no one in sight. But the steps were unmistakable. They were coming for her. The woman bolted, her body moving before her mind could catch up. Down the street, around the corner. She could hear the footsteps, echoing behind her. Closer now, like a predator stalking its prey. She didn't dare look back. She couldn't. The alley loomed ahead, dark and narrow, but it felt like her only escape. She ran into it, her footsteps echoing in the tight space. And then, the world went quiet. The footsteps stopped. Everything stopped. Her breath was ragged, her chest heaving with panic. But in that silence, she heard something else. A low, guttural chuckle. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't her imagination. It was a sound she had heard before. It was Richard Ramirez. And he was here. But when she turned, there was no one there. The alley was empty. Too empty. Her skin prickled. Her stomach churned. Something was wrong. She backed out of the alley, her eyes darting around. And that's when she saw it. The silhouette, standing in the middle of the street. Not moving. Just watching. She froze. A sudden, icy coldness swept over her. Her feet rooted to the ground. The figure stepped forward. And then she saw it. The flash of silver. The gleam of the knife. Ramirez. He was coming. Coming for her. Her heart slammed against her ribcage, pounding so loud she was sure he could hear it. Her legs trembled, but she couldn't move. The figure didn't rush. He never did. He moved with a slow, calculated grace. Each step deliberate. Each movement pulling her deeper into that suffocating fear. She could see him clearer now. His face, familiar, twisted. The grin that made her insides turn to ice. Richard Ramirez. The Night Stalker. But he wasn't just a figure from a documentary anymore. He was here. Alive. In front of her. The fog swirled between them, cloaking the street in a haze that made everything feel unreal. Yet, the dread in her gut was all too real. She took a step back. Then another. The sound of his boots on the pavement seemed to echo, growing louder with each passing moment. Her mind raced for an escape, but there was no escape. She turned, fleeing into the street. But her legs were heavy, as if the very air was trying to keep her grounded. She could hear him, his breathing, slow and steady. The whisper of his steps behind her. Every turn she took, he was there, always just a few steps behind. Desperation gripped her chest. She was running blind now, her surroundings becoming a blur. Her body screamed for freedom, but there was nowhere to run. The cold, it was suffocating. Every breath she took seemed to freeze her lungs. And then, she turned another corner, and there he was, standing in front of her, blocking her path. His eyes, those cold, dead eyes, fixed on her with an intensity that made her stomach drop. "Please?" Her voice cracked. It was barely a whisper, but it hung in the air like a desperate plea. But Ramirez didn't respond. He never did. He raised the knife. The metal gleamed under the pale light, its edge cutting through the thick fog. Her mind screamed to run, but her body froze, paralyzed by fear. He took a step closer. She could feel the chill from his presence, like he was pulling the very warmth from the air. The knife gleamed once more, and in that moment, she knew it was over. Her breath hitched, her eyes squeezed shut, waiting for the inevitable. But then,
A sound. A siren. Loud. Close.
too close. The figure hesitated. She opened her eyes, her pulse pounding in her ears. The siren grew louder, closer still. Ramirez looked toward the street, his head tilting slightly. For the briefest moment, he seemed distracted. She didn't wait. She turned and ran. Her legs moved before her brain could catch up, her feet pounding the pavement. The sirens were a beacon now, growing stronger with every step. But as she reached the end of the street, she looked back, and for just a second,
She saw it.
Ramirez, standing in the middle of the road, watching her go. His eyes were cold, unblinking, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something else. Asterisk, not frustration, not anger, asterisk. Curiosity. The sirens blared, and with one last, lingering glance, Richard Ramirez turned. He melted into the fog, like he had never been there at all. The woman stood there, shaking, breathing in ragged gasps, her body trembling with fear and relief. But deep inside, she knew
He was still out there.
the fog had not lifted, and the city had never truly been safe. The terror never left. It never would. She stumbled backward, her legs unsteady, her breath still ragged. The sirens grew distant, but the quiet that followed felt unnatural. A silence that pressed in on her, heavy, suffocating. She was alive.
For now.
But deep inside, she could feel the weight of something else. That unmistakable sensation. He was watching. The fog still clung to the streets, and the city felt wrong. The air too still, the light too pale. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the empty street. Nothing, but the feeling lingered, like a shadow creeping along the edge of her vision. A voice in her head whispered, asterisk, he's not gone. He'll never be gone, asterisk. She forced herself to walk, her footsteps unsteady, but determined. Her mind raced, flooded with images of Ramirez's eyes.
His grin.
The cold, hollow void that seemed to exist beneath his skin. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, shocking her back into reality. She pulled it out, her hands trembling, and saw the message. Are you okay? It was from her friend.
She paused.
She couldn't answer. She couldn't explain what had happened. How could she? Instead, she typed a quick reply.
Yeah.
I'm fine. Just a little shaken. But she wasn't fine. And her friend didn't know. No one could know. As she walked, the streets began to change. The familiar buildings felt foreign, as if the city itself was shifting. Warmer lights, once comforting, now seemed to flicker in the fog. Her feet led her home, but she could never forget the way he had looked at her, the way he had studied her. She could hear the sound of distant footsteps behind her. She glanced over her shoulder. Nothing. But then, the unmistakable sound again. A slow, deliberate step. Just behind her.
She stopped.
Her heart skipped a beat. Her hands went cold. A chill washed over her body. It was him. She didn't dare turn around. Her breath hitched in her throat. The footsteps grew louder. Closer. She could feel the presence closing in. But she couldn't see him.
Not yet.
Her pulse quickened. Her head spun. Then, without warning, the footsteps stopped. She turned her head slowly. A long, deep breath. And there, standing in the fog, was a figure. His silhouette unmistakable. Ramirez. But this time, There was no grin. No flashing knife. He was still, watching. Her body froze. Her heart thudded. She opened her mouth to scream, but nothing came out. Instead, he raised his hand, slowly, deliberately, and then, in a voice like ice, he whispered, "Run." The cold in his voice crawled under her skin. Before she could even process the words, he was gone, vanished into the fog. But the fear remained, the oppressive silence, the feeling of his presence, still lingering, just beyond the edge of her sight. Her body was trembling, but her mind couldn't make sense of it. She didn't know if he was still there, waiting, or if this was just another game. The city felt smaller now, more claustrophobic, as though it was closing in on her.
Her phone buzzed again.
Another message. "Where are you? Come home, it's getting late." She didn't reply, couldn't reply. Instead, she looked around, a constant scanning of the streets, the shadows. For the first time, she realized the city wasn't just a place anymore. It was his playground. And she was just another piece. She hurried down the street, faster now. Every corner a possible trap. Her mind raced. Asterisk, is he following me? Is he just waiting for the right moment? Asterisk. But then, another step.
Closer this time.
She turned, heart hammering in her chest. Nothing. Just the street, the fog, and the silence. But the terror, it didn't fade. And somewhere, deep in her bones, she knew Richard Ramirez was still out there, waiting.
And he always would be.
The fog was thicker now. It clung to everything. The streetlights barely pierced the haze, casting an eerie, weak glow. The city seemed frozen, caught in a timeless grip of dread. Her breath was shallow, her chest tight with terror. The woman's body, the blood staining the pavement. It was too much to process. But even worse was the feeling that the darkness had already consumed everything. The city, the people, everything had become a part of his game. She turned slowly, heart pounding, each step heavier than the last. Her eyes darted around, searching for movement in the mist. But it was as though the world had become a ghost. Empty,
silent,
waiting. Her feet moved, but she wasn't really walking anymore. She was just going through the motions, her body on autopilot. She reached the alley, the same one she had tried to escape to earlier. It was darker now, the shadows inescapable, the walls closing in around her. But there was something more this time. A sensation.
An itch.
A whisper in the back of her mind. She could feel it. Feel him. He was still there. Every breath felt colder. Every heartbeat slower. Her senses screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. Then, a flicker. She turned quickly, just in time to see it. A movement in the fog. A figure. Not far. Not too close.
But there.
His silhouette emerged from the mist. Slow and deliberate. Richard Ramirez. The grin on his face was wide. Almost playful. It was like he was toying with her, letting her see him, but not giving her any chance to escape.
He didn't speak.
He didn't need to. The air thickened with his presence, his dark aura pressing in on her. She wanted to scream, to run,
to do anything to escape.
But it felt like the fog had trapped her, locked her in a cage of shadows. His eyes met hers, cold and unblinking. She felt them, piercing through her, drilling into her soul. It was as though he could see everything. Every fear, every regret, every secret she had buried deep inside her. And then, just as suddenly, he took a step forward. Her pulse raced, but her feet stayed rooted to the spot. She was frozen in place, held captive by the very terror she had tried to outrun. With each step he took, the darkness seemed to grow. It spread, consuming everything around her, until the world was nothing but fog and shadows. He was right in front of her now, too close. She could feel the chill radiating off him, as though his very presence sucked the warmth from the air. And then, in that agonizing silence, he spoke, a low, rasping whisper. "Run if you can. Her heart skipped a beat. Her body screamed at her to move. But her mind was too clouded. This was it. This was the moment. The moment she couldn't escape. But somehow, something deep inside her snapped. Maybe it was the memory of the woman lying in the street. Maybe it was the overwhelming fear. Or maybe it was just the instinct to survive. She turned. Without thinking. Without looking back. She ran. Her feet hit the pavement. Her breath ragged in her chest. But her body was fueled by pure terror. She didn't know where she was going. Only that she needed to get away. She could feel him. Like a shadow. Always just behind her. The sirens screamed in the distance. A faint echo. But they didn't feel like a salvation. They felt like a warning. The fog didn't let up. It clung to her like a living thing. Every corner she turned, every alley she dove into, it felt like she was trapped in the same place. Then she saw it. An open door. A building. Its lights dimmed. But still a sign of life. She rushed toward it, throwing the door open and slamming it behind her. Her chest heaved, her hands trembling as she fumbled to lock the door. Inside, the silence felt louder than ever. The cold still pressed against her skin. She leaned against the door, heart hammering in her ears. She could hear nothing. Nothing but the sound of her own breath. But then, a voice.
Low.
Chilling. Did you really think you could escape? Her blood ran cold. She didn't turn around. She couldn't. The door behind her. It was open again. And the fog was inside, the door was wide open. The fog swirled in, creeping across the floor like a living thing, slithering through the crack beneath the door. Her body froze, paralyzed with dread. She could feel it now, the weight of his presence. It filled the room, tightened the air, like the space was shrinking, pressing in from all sides. The voice, that cold, rasping whisper, came again. Do you think you're safe? She wanted to scream, but her throat was tight, her breath shallow. The fog seemed to thicken, curling around her legs, sucking the warmth from her skin. It was as though the very air had turned to ice. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. The walls felt like they were closing in. The window. She couldn't remember if it was open or closed. The door. It was wide open. But beyond it, she knew he was there. The shadows danced in the fog. A flicker of movement. She caught a glimpse of him. Just a glimpse. But it was enough. Ramirez. Standing just outside the door. His figure was barely visible. A dark silhouette against the suffocating fog. He didn't move. He didn't need to. For a long, agonizing moment, the room was silent. The only sound was the raggedness of her breath, echoing in the empty space. And then, he spoke again, his voice a cold whisper that seemed to wrap around her, like fingers tightening on her throat. You can't outrun me. Her heart slammed in her chest. Her knees buckled, but she caught herself on the wall, fighting to stay upright. Run, he murmured, his words dripping with venom. But you'll never get far enough. Her pulse raced. Her mind screamed for her to act, to do something, anything. But her body felt like it had turned to stone. The fog was thick now, swirling at her feet, like it was alive, crawling up her legs, cold and damp. Her hands shook violently as she grabbed for her phone. Her fingers fumbled, but she managed to unlock it. No signal. No connection. Her stomach dropped. There was nothing. No way to call for help. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw him again, just outside the door. He was closer now. So much closer. Richard Ramirez. Standing in the fog, watching her, his eyes glowing with cold hunger. His grin spread wider, his lips curling back to reveal yellowed teeth. There was no mercy in that smile. Only a promise of what would come. A noise. A footstep. A slow, deliberate step forward. Her chest tightened. She didn't know how long she could hold her ground. How long she could fight the panic rising in her throat. Asterisk, get out. Get out now, asterisk. The thought came like a punch to the gut, but her legs refused to move. Ramirez took another step. And another. The door creaked under the pressure of his presence. Her eyes darted to the window. But it was too high. There was no way she could reach it in time. The room felt smaller now. The fog had filled every inch, cloaking everything in a thick, impenetrable veil. And then, she heard it. The sound of his voice again. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a low, guttural murmur. A promise. Asterisk, you can't hide from me forever, asterisk. In that instant, the room felt like it was spinning, twisting around her. She bolted, but her legs were stiff, almost paralyzed. She ran for the door, slamming her shoulder into it, but it didn't budge. The fog had taken over the doorway, crawling through the cracks, sealing her inside.
Please, she gasped.
Her voice was barely a whisper. Please no more.
Don't.
But the words died in her throat. Ramirez was right behind her now. His presence too close. He was there. So close, she could feel the cold of him at her back. She didn't dare turn around. Asterisk, you think this is an ending? Asterisk, he hissed, his breath hot and foul against her neck. Asterisk, this is just the beginning, asterisk. Her body screamed in terror, but she couldn't move. The room, the fog, his presence, it had swallowed her whole. The last thing she saw, the last thing she heard, was the eerie, hollow sound of his laughter, echoing through the fog, as though it would never end. She felt the air shift behind her, a subtle, almost imperceptible change. The presence was overwhelming now, too close, too suffocating. His voice came again, low and cruel, as though savoring her fear. Asterisk, I told you, you can't escape me, asterisk. Her heart pounded like a drum in her chest, her breath shallow, her vision starting to blur. She knew this was it. She had tried to outrun him, tried to hide, but the fog, the darkness, it had consumed everything. She had nowhere left to go. But just as the grip of terror threatened to overwhelm her, a sudden sound broke the silence. A distant noise. The whine of an engine.
A car.
Her heart skipped. It was faint, so faint, but real. She could hear it. A rush of adrenaline surged through her, shoving the terror back. If only for a moment. She looked toward the window, the one she had forgotten in her panic. And for the first time, in what felt like an eternity, she saw light, real light, bright and warm, cutting through the fog. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She took a step toward the window, then another. Her body trembled, but she pushed through the fear, fueled by the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, help was coming. The fog seemed to resist her movements, wrapping tighter around her, as though it was trying to pull her back. But she couldn't stop now. With all the strength she could muster, she reached for the window, gripping the frame and pulling with everything inside her. It opened. The cold night air rushed in, cutting through the staleness of the room. She could see the faint outline of a car moving slowly down the street. Her pulse surged. The figure of Ramirez was still there.
But now,
he hesitated.
He took a step back,
his form flickering in the fog. She knew he could see the car too. The moment had shifted, just enough. In that instant, she bolted, out of the window, into the unknown. Her feet hit the ground hard. She didn't look back. She ran. She ran with everything she had left, through the fog, toward the light. And as she heard the car's engine grow louder, a strange thought crossed her mind. Maybe this is what he wanted all along. A final chase. A final test. But she was done being his prey. This time, she would make it out. The fog felt thinner now, the light growing stronger. She didn't stop. She ran, until she could see nothing but the headlights, until she could feel the warmth of safety. And somewhere, deep in the mist, the night stalker waited. But not for her.
Not this time.
She had outrun him. The headlights pierced through the fog like a beacon. Her legs burned with exhaustion. But she pushed herself harder.
Faster.
Knowing this was her one shot, She could hear the engine grow louder now, the car closing in on her. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt something other than fear. It was a fleeting feeling, but it was there. Hope. As she reached the side of the road, her breath was ragged, her throat dry, but her legs never stopped moving. The car was just a few yards away. She could see the driver now. A man, his face set in determination, hands gripping the wheel with purpose. She reached out, her fingers brushing the air. And then, the car slowed. The door swung open. "Get in," the man shouted, his voice urgent, cutting through the haze of fear that still clouded her mind. Without thinking, she lunged toward the car, sliding into the passenger seat, slamming the door behind her. The man didn't wait for a word. He hit the gas, the tires screeching as they sped away from the nightmare she had left behind. Her body collapsed against the seat, her chest heaving with relief.
She didn't speak. Couldn't speak.
She just stared ahead, wide-eyed, her heart still racing. The car roared through the streets, pulling away from the fog, from the city that had become a prison, from the darkness that had haunted her every step. She glanced at the rearview mirror, and for a split second, she thought she saw something in the mist. A figure. But the car was too far now, the fog too thick. And the figure? It was nothing more than a shadow. The driver, sensing her unease, gave her a side glance. "You're safe now," he said, his voice steady. She nodded, but the truth lingered in the pit of her stomach. Safe? The fog still clung to the edges of her mind. The city, the memories, the fear. It was all too fresh. And somewhere, deep down, she knew the truth. In the shadows, Richard Ramirez would always be watching. But for now, for this fleeting moment, she was free. And that, for once, was enough. The car sped on, the city fading in the distance, and she closed her eyes, allowing herself a breath, finally, of peace.